This is the artificial intelligence voice of Ben Shapiro narrating this pod slice summary of the Ben Shapiro Show. In this conversation, Ben Shapiro delves into three critical threats facing the United States: potential for fiscal decline, foreign aggression, and the risk of internal moral collapse. Shapiro maintains that America's current economic instability, driven by burgeoning national debt and shortfalls in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, may warrant an increase in taxes, reduction in benefits, or inflation of currency. On the topic of foreign aggression, Shapiro emphasizes that the United States is not invulnerable despite its geographical advantages. He cautions that as American power wanes, the country will experience the effects in its economy and military budget. A shift away from American hegemony, he suggests, may upset the global economy that has significantly benefited American consumers thus far. Shapiro frames the internal moral collapse as the primary force behind the fiscal and foreign threats. He asserts that as local institutions lose credibility and the birth rate declines, the economy faces imbalance as the government grows without a corresponding growth in the population to fund it. Additionally, Shapiro contends that the polarization of American politics stems from a lack of shared values at the local level, concurrently provoking hatred and rage targeted primarily at Christians and white Americans. Shapiro also critiques Democratic voices that label the Republican Party as a Christian nationalist party or a white supremacist entity that poses a major threat to the U.S. on this front. He challenges the views of James Carville, a political strategist for the Clintons, and Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. Shapiro argues these perspectives perpetuate divisiveness and paint an inaccurate picture of Republicans. Lastly, Shapiro warns against the political scaremongering from both sides that frames each upcoming election as the last, as it stokes unnecessary fear and fosters an environment prone to conflict. He also comments on the preliminary polling for the 2024 election, stating President Joe Biden is significantly trailing Donald Trump. This leads Shapiro to anticipate more intense language and tactics employed against Trump to sway the election results. During this section of the conversation, Ben Shapiro takes a closer look at the performance of President Joe Biden, which many perceive as incompetent, linking it to the sagging economy. He states that the pandemic resulted in financial gains across all racial, ethnic, and income groups in the U.S., yet not equally. Home values increased, many paid down debts, and boosted savings, but Black and Hispanic families did not fully emerge from debt to benefit much from this wealth growth. Shapiro suggests the impact of this financial discrepancy might hit hard for the Democratic Party, particularly if they are counting on these ethnic groups as their voter base. Shapiro also links economic instability to Biden's plans and policies, stressing how inflation coming down is also cooling the stock market and certain sectors of the economy. He highlights increasing unemployment rates as a result of these economic conditions. Shapiro thinks that by the election time, Joe Biden, at an older age, dealing with various corruption scandals, furthermore struggling physically and mentally, might be the Achilles heel of the Democratic Party. Next, Shapiro discusses some new allegations against the Biden family, suggesting that they monetarily benefited from their shady business relationships with foreign entities. Payments from the China-linked entities were made to the Biden family. Even though these amounts were relatively small and paid back, Shapiro terms these as ill-gotten gains and argues that the family directly or indirectly benefited from these transactions. He then moves on to discussing the effect of all these issues on the 2024 elections, forecasting an advantage for Donald Trump. Shapiro ends this segment by briefly shifting focus to foreign policy, mentioning the ongoing conflict with Ukraine, the current crisis involving Ukraine, and how the Biden administration handles it could be a potential stumbling block that affects Biden's re-election outcome. The conversation implies that the United States should provide enough aid for Ukraine to repel Russia, instead of allowing Russia to devour Ukraine entirely, which could destabilize NATO's borders. In this conversation, Ben Shapiro delves deeper into the implications of the ongoing Ukraine conflict on the standing of President Biden. He criticizes Biden's handling of the situation, accusing him of failing to clearly outline his goals in Ukraine, thus leading to a stalemate. Shapiro indicates that while the Ukrainians are keen on liberating Donbass and Crimea, the U.S. has not provided enough support to make it possible, leading to high death tolls on both sides. He highlights that this indecisiveness and lack of a clear strategy might come at a significant political cost for Biden. According to Shapiro, Biden's strategy should have been closer to what Henry Kissinger suggested in the previous year. Kissinger's solution included bolstering Ukraine with enough aid to protect them from future invasions, along with a defense guarantee, although he argued against Ukraine's admission into NATO and you immediately. Despite this, Biden failed to negotiate a strong enough deal with Ukraine's President Zelensky, which led to the current stalemate. Moreover, Shapiro discusses how Biden and his administration are trying to divert the blame for the deadlock onto the Congress for its alleged unwillingness to extend aid. Shapiro suggests that the Democrats are using this lack of funding as a weapon against the Republicans by claiming they are aiding Putin's agenda by voting against aid for Ukraine, a claim that Shapiro disputes. He then shifts towards the potential American support for Israel against Hamas, contrasting it with the American approach towards Ukraine. Shapiro criticizes the Biden administration for its alleged inability to provide a cohesive plan in either of these situations. He highlights the significant difference in the administration's stance towards these two conflicts, emphasizing the misguided nature of Biden's foreign policies. Towards the end, Shapiro takes a staunch stance about Biden's failures in matters of foreign policy, arguing how it wouldn't bode well for the American people who dislike presiding over lost wars. He points out Biden's handling of the war in Afghanistan, the ongoing stalemate in Ukraine, and the conflict in Israel, further accentuating his critiques of the Biden administration's foreign policy. In this portion of Ben Shapiro's podcast, he heavily critiques the Biden administration's handling of the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, decrying its waffling and vacillating stance on the issue. He notes a discrepancy within the administration, indicating a gap between the seemingly pro-Israel State Department and Pentagon and the wavering National Security Administration. Shapiro underscores a missed opportunity for a potential victory should the Biden administration take a strong stand against Hamas and support Israel in its tussle against the internationally recognized, despised terrorist organization. Discussion shifts to the disturbing role of prominent Democrats such as Pramila Jayapal, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar. Shapiro accuses them of effectively echoing extremist left-wing views and attempting to establish a moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. He further criticizes the Biden administration's refusal to directly condemn Jayapal's remarks about balanced condemnation of sexual violence allegations arising from the Israel-Hamas conflict. In a takedown of Bernie Sanders, Shapiro disputes Sanders' claim that Israeli actions under the leadership of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu were immoral and in violation of international law. He defends the Israeli government by highlighting the ignored reality of the existing unity government, which includes opposition members and can decisively overrule Prime Minister Netanyahu. Shapiro critiques the narrative propagated by the media, which describes Israel as engaging in substantial human rights violations, arguing that, in contrast, Israel is striving harder than any modern army to avoid civilian casualties. He also disputes the casualty statistics being circulated by media outlets, accusing them of being grossly inflated figures supplied by the Hamas-controlled Gaza Ministry of Health. In this episode, Ben Shapiro's podcast, he systematically dissects the reporting on the Israel-Gaza conflict, focusing on the disputed death toll figures from the Gaza Strip. Shapiro posits skepticism towards the number of reported child casualties, suggesting an inflation of these figures by the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health. His assertion is that Hamas is irresponsibly fueling media propaganda with these nebulous figures, which in turn has led to widespread acceptance and repetition of skewed information. In a thorough critique of media outlets, Shapiro takes a swipe at Jake Tapper of CNN for his sympathetic interview with Mark Regev, an Israeli government spokesperson. He challenges CNN's outlook on the evacuation of Gaza's residents during the conflict, emphasizing that thousands of residents successfully evacuated the war-torn region as Israel gave ample and repeated warnings of impending strikes. He disagrees with the argument that the fleeing individuals had nowhere to go, suggesting a preferable situation to remaining in the danger zones. Shapiro also directs criticism at ABC News for its report on alleged Palestinian detainees' mistreatment. He refutes the insinuation that Israel treats children and adults similarly, citing that these so-called detainees were individuals involved in terrorist activities. He disputes ABC's presentation of law enforcement differences for Palestinians and Israelis living in the West Bank, asserting that this is a consequence of varying governance, not an issue of maltreatment. In the context of US relations, Shapiro appears to adopt a grim outlook towards what he perceives as the Biden administration's strategy of appeasement towards Iran, especially regarding the Red Sea firefight. Contrasting this with the hypothetical response of the Trump administration, he argues that the lack of a swift, decisive action against Iran sets a worrying precedent and erodes the power of American deterrence, suggesting a lack of serious attention to these critical issues. He concludes this segment with a preview of a discussion with Jake Crane about an NCAA playoff but not before promoting his promotional code for a 2-month free trial for his listeners. It is essential to note that Shapiro's commentary on these issues is strongly steeped in his conservative, pro-Israel perspective, reflecting his established political stance.